Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our current coffee break webinar on developmental evaluation. What is it and how do you do it? Hopefully you have a cup of coffee with you, and if the weather is like here in Dayton, Ohio, where you are, then you have a cold cup of coffee. Before we get started, let me go over a couple of housekeeping items. It's important that you have an opportunity to ask questions, so use the question function on your computer to be able to do that. And we have with us today Elise Hopes, our outreach coordinator, who will be helping to moderate the Q&A as well as address any questions or computer issues that you may have. And then also, let me introduce myself to you as well. I'm Lana Rux. I am principal consultant of the Rux Group, and the Rux Group is a research and evaluation firm that gathers, analyzes, and interprets data to enable our clients to measure the impact of their work. We were formed in 2008, and over the past several years, we've had the privilege of working with a variety of clients, primarily within higher education, on grants funded by private foundations and federal agencies such as the National Science Foundation, Department of Education, and the Department of Labor. To create the context for today, I want you to think about when you've renovated a space or remodeled a room, and if you're like me, you had expectations of something like this. Very pristine, a nice clean space. And if you're also like me, the reality of family intrudes, and the way the room looks is probably more like this. Not so pristine and a little messy. Well, that can happen too when we're talking about grants. When we're planning out a grant, we have expectations that things will go a certain way, but then reality hits, and some of those emerging factors impact on otherwise well-crafted plan. And I think that this brings into the importance of what developmental evaluation is. Developmental evaluation is really intended as a structure for handling the messy, the unexpected aspects of implementing a new initiative. Developmental evaluation used to be a concept that was primarily discussed among evaluation circles, but I'm starting to see that conversation is moving beyond the evaluation space. For instance, in a recent funding opportunity announcement by the DOL, there was a reference to an encouragement to use developmental evaluation. So with that as context, there are a couple of things that I wanted to be able to do during our time together. One, I wanted to define what developmental evaluation is. But then I want to try to simplify that and give some information about what that actually looks like in practice, as well as providing some examples of how to actually incorporate developmental evaluation into an initiative. And then, of course, want to be able to answer your questions. So again, make sure to use that chat function on your computer. So let's start first by talking about what is developmental evaluation. So developmental evaluation was originally introduced into the literature by Michael Quinn Patent, who is a prolific writer on evaluation. And he defines developmental evaluation as the following. He says it supports innovation development to guide adaptation to emergent and dynamic realities in complex environments. Let's try to unpack that just a little bit. So in regards to supports innovation development, so developmental evaluation is really relevant to new ideas and new initiatives and to projects that have not really been well established or initiatives in which there's not a lot of research associated with it, even in regards to just how to appropriately implement. The other piece to this is that it's intended to guide adaptation. So it's helped to provide insights into how to be flexible and how to adapt to situations and occurrences that are not expected. And this is going to happen because they're being implemented within an emergent and dynamic realities. So I know for many of us right now in the current context with COVID, there's a lot that we've had to adjust in terms of emergent and dynamic realities. But even in normal situations, very often implementing new initiatives can occur within these emergent and dynamic contexts. And then the environment in which they're being implemented is complex. So you take all these factors together, and there's just a lot of variables that are impacting on how the project is being implemented. So that gives you a sense of what developmental evaluation is in terms of its denotation. Let me see if I can try to put some meat on the bones by thinking about the characteristics or some of the connotations associated with developmental evaluation, at least the connotations that I think of. So this is really from my perspective and trying to really unpack what exists in the literature around developmental evaluation. So the first characteristic that I think that is characteristic of developmental evaluation is that it reflects high level of interest in learning by the project team. Let me give you an example of that. We work with a project that was funded by the Department of Labor, and the purpose of this project was really to create a national model for flexible apprenticeships to increase the pipeline of workers in a high demand area. Now that seems like on the surface a garden variety evaluation project. But what's important to know is that in this context, the project team partnered with an evaluation entity even though the funder didn't require it. And that's in large part because they wanted to make sure that that learning and that evaluative information was intentionally being gathered. And not only did this project team have this emphasis on evaluation, but the other piece is, as well is that they make sure to actually use the evaluation findings. So when measuring out the before and after learning of a workshop, they're looking at abnormalities in the findings. So for instance, when people are reporting that they knew more on a particular topic before their workshop than afterwards, they're digging back through that workshop, that training, to understand was something that conveyed that may have been confusing. And then even on a small level, looking at something like response rates, it's something that they're very responsive to. So in a situation in which they were disseminating a survey and they had a 9% response rate, they were uncomfortable with that in terms of the quality of the data to be able to guide decisions, because we know that the larger the response rate, the more representative it is of the target audience. So they went back and strategized on how they could increase the response rate, and were able to increase that to 40%. So together, really reflects that high level and high emphasis and interest in learning. I think another piece to keep in mind about developmental evaluation is that it's not necessarily new methods and new techniques. It's how you approach traditional evaluative approaches and how they're combined together, as well as the perspective that you take in the implementation process. So to illustrate this, I'm going to talk about another DOL project from the TACT grant. But before, let me lay the foundation in this regard. So if you think about traditional evaluation, you have the formative evaluation, and then you have the summative evaluation that's associated with that. In this situation, what you can have instead from a developmental standpoint is that you have developmental kind of emphasis, and then you have the summative evaluation after that. And the way to think about that developmental piece is that that developmental piece really maps onto that plan, do, study, act model. And you're cycling through in terms of tweaking and making modifications to the initiative until you feel comfortable to really be able to begin the summative evaluation piece of that. So, as I was saying, I did want to talk about another DOL grant, in which, in this particular situation, the project was really focused on being able to provide displaced and incumbent workers an opportunity to quickly advance their credentials in the field with job openings. So, on a rolling basis, they were participating in a credentialing program. And so, what was really important was retention and completion of that program. And so, over a 21-month period, we tracked out retention rates. And this is what retention rate looked like over that time frame. However, I should highlight that those first 4 cohorts were really focused in on developmental evaluation, in which there was a lot of consideration, a lot of changes in terms of how the project was being implemented. And then once that phase was completed, then the actual outcomes or the summative evaluation was conducted. So that's important because in that first kind of new learning phase, retention rate was close to 48%. But once a lot of the new tools and resources were implemented, retention rate was actually increased to 63%. So this is a way in which developmental evaluation can be folded into an evaluation, even though you're still primarily looking at and interested in summative evaluation components. So let me pause there for a moment and see if there are any questions. Elise, does anyone have any questions so far?
Hi, Lana. There is a question. So you touched on the relationship between formative and summative evaluation and developmental evaluation. Could you explain a little bit more about the connection?
Yes. So part of this is like my own way that I think about the relationships between these 3 concepts. So I'm just going to call it formative, summative, and developmental just to make it simpler. So formative is about implementation, and summative is about outcomes and to some extent impact as well. The way that I think of developmental is that it's a cycling through a formative and summative so that you're implementing and then you're seeing what's happening and you're implementing, you're seeing what's happening. So it's much more of a cycling through in regards to how you're approaching the evaluation. But there can be definitely times when there is, like I said before, a hard stop where you're not tweaking anymore and you are doing kind of a traditional summative evaluation approach. So that's kind of how I see that relationship between those 3 different components. I should also say to you that if you, even when you're looking at the literature on developmental evaluation, one of the senses that you may get is that the real difference between evaluation in terms of, developmental evaluation in terms of its approach versus formative is a matter of degree. So with formative, there may be smaller tweaks, but with developmental, there may be much larger changes. So hopefully that kind of background helps in understanding what the relationship is between those 3 different concepts. So,
Thank you, Lana. That's all for now.
okay, fabulous. So let me go on and talk about a couple of more characteristics of developmental evaluation.